My husband died, leaving everything to his devoted daughter. At his funeral, she whispered, "Finally, the old man is gone." I smiled and handed her an envelope that made her face go white. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. The rain drummed against the funeral home windows as I stood beside Richard's casket. My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. 43 years of marriage to my first husband, then 15 beautiful years with Richard. And now, at 67, I was alone again. The flowers filled the room with their heavy perfume, but all I could smell was the antiseptic scent that had followed us home from the hospital during Richard's final weeks. My name is Margaret, and if you had told me 6 months ago that I'd be standing at my husband's funeral suspecting his own daughter of betrayal, I would have called you crazy. You see, I'm not the kind of woman who looks for trouble or sees conspiracies around every corner. I'm the neighbor who brings you soup when you're sick, the woman who still writes thank you cards by hand, and the stepmother who considered Richard's daughter, Sarah, to be the child I never had. When I married Richard 15 years ago, Sarah was just 25, a bright, ambitious young woman who had just graduated from law school. I remember our first meeting so clearly. She hugged me at the door and said, "I'm so happy Dad found someone who makes him smile again." I fell in love with her warmth immediately. Richard had lost his first wife to cancer when Sarah was just 15, and he'd raised her alone until we met. I saw it as my privilege to step into their lives and help heal the wounds that grief had left behind. Over the years, I poured my heart into our blended family. When Sarah struggled with student loans, Richard and I used my inheritance from my mother to pay them off. When she went through a difficult divorce 3 years ago, she lived in our guest room for 6 months while she got back on her feet. I held her while she cried, helped her find a new apartment, and even paid for the security deposit when money was tight. I loved her birthday parties, celebrated her promotions, and listened to her dreams about finding love again. Sarah called me every Sunday, sometimes talking for hours about her work as a corporate attorney, her dating life, and her plans for the future. She'd often say, "I'm so lucky to have you, Margaret. You're more than a stepmother. You're my second mom." Those words filled my heart with such joy. I had always regretted never having children of my own, and Sarah filled that void completely. I thought I knew her heart. I thought I understood the depth of our bond. I believed that the love we shared was real, built on years of trust, sacrifice, and genuine care for each other. Richard would often comment on how blessed he felt to have 2 women in his life who loved each other so dearly. "My girls," he'd call us, beaming with pride whenever Sarah and I would team up to tease him about his terrible cooking or his habit of falling asleep in his recliner. But as I stood there at the funeral, watching Sarah dab at her eyes with a tissue while whispering cruel words that cut through my soul like glass, I realized I had been living a lie. The woman I had loved like a daughter, the person I had trusted with my deepest fears and greatest joys, had been wearing a mask for 15 years. And now, with Richard gone, she was finally ready to show me her true face. Before everything changed, my life with Richard was like something out of a fairy tale. Not the dramatic kind with evil stepmothers and glass slippers, but the quiet, beautiful kind where 2 people find peace and happiness in their golden years. Every morning, I'd wake up at 6:30 and slip quietly out of bed, careful not to disturb Richard, who liked to sleep in until 7. The kitchen would be bathed in soft morning light as I prepared our coffee. His black with 2 sugars, mine with cream and honey. I'd carry both mugs out to our wraparound porch, settling into the white wicker chairs we'd bought during our 5th anniversary trip to Charleston. The view from our porch was breathtaking. Rolling hills dotted with oak trees, and in the distance, the small town where we'd built our life together. Richard would join me eventually, his silver hair still messy from sleep, wearing the faded blue robe I'd given him for Christmas 3 years ago. He'd kiss my forehead and mutter something about me being too good to him, then settle into his chair with a contented sigh. We'd sit in comfortable silence, watching the world wake up around us. Sometimes deer would venture into our yard, and Richard would point them out with the excitement of a child, even though we'd seen them hundreds of times before. Our days had a beautiful rhythm. After breakfast, I'd tend to my garden, rows of tomatoes, peppers, and herbs that I used in our meals. Richard would putter around his workshop, fixing neighbors' broken furniture or crafting birdhouses that he'd give away to anyone who admired them. The house we'd designed together was filled with evidence of our contentment. Photographs from our travels, quilts I'd made during winter evenings, and Richard's woodworking projects scattered throughout every room. Lunch was always together on the back patio, where we'd share stories about our morning activities and plan our afternoon. Richard loved to tell me about the progress on whatever project had captured his attention, his eyes lighting up as he described the wood grain or the challenge of a particularly tricky joint. I'd update him on the garden, the neighborhood gossip I'd gathered during my morning walk, or the book I was reading for our monthly book club. Evenings were our sacred time. After dinner, always prepared together because Richard insisted on helping despite his terrible chopping skills, we'd take our evening walk through the neighborhood. Richard knew everyone's name, their children's names, and their pets' names too. He'd wave at Mrs. Peterson watering her roses, stop to chat with young Mr. Collins about his new baby, and always carried dog treats in his pocket for the various pups we'd encounter along our route. Sarah was woven throughout our peaceful routine like golden thread through fabric. Her Sunday phone calls were the highlight of my week. I'd put her on speaker so Richard could participate, and we'd spend an hour hearing about her cases, her social life, and her dreams. She'd ask about the garden, request recipes from her childhood, and always end the call by saying, "I love you both so much. You're the best parents anyone could ask for." The house felt complete during her visits. She'd arrive with flowers for me and Richard's favorite cigars, settling into our routine as if she'd never left. We'd cook together, share inside jokes, and stay up late talking about everything and nothing. Richard would beam with pride as he watched Sarah and me laughing in the kitchen, and I'd catch him wiping away happy tears when he thought we weren't looking. This was our life, simple, loving, and perfectly content. I thought it would last forever. The first crack in my perfect world appeared on a Tuesday morning in March, barely 3 weeks after Richard's cancer diagnosis. I was in the hospital cafeteria buying Richard's favorite chocolate pudding, the only thing he could keep down after his chemotherapy sessions, when I heard Sarah's voice drifting from around the corner. No, you don't understand," she was saying into her phone, her voice sharp with irritation. "The old man is finally sick enough that we can move forward. She won't suspect anything if we're careful about timing." I froze, my hand hovering over the pudding cups. Sarah was supposed to be upstairs with her father, holding his hand while he slept off the effects of his latest treatment. Who was she talking to? And why did her tone sound so cold, so calculated? I stepped closer to the corner, my heart beginning to race. "I've been working on this for months," Sarah continued. "Trust me, by the time Margaret figures out what's happening, it'll be too late. The paperwork is almost ready, and Dad's been asking fewer questions lately. The medication makes him more agreeable." My blood turned to ice. She was talking about Richard, her own father, like he was some kind of obstacle to overcome. And she was talking about me like I was the enemy. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make sense of what I was hearing, but Sarah's voice was moving away as she walked toward the elevators. When I returned to Richard's room, Sarah was there with tears in her eyes, holding his hand tenderly. "Oh, Margaret," she said, jumping up to hug me. "I'm so glad you're back. Dad was just asking for you. He's having one of his good moments." Richard smiled weakly at me from his hospital bed. "There's my beautiful wife," he whispered, reaching out his hand. "Sarah's been keeping me company. Such a good daughter." I sat down and took his hand, studying Sarah's face for any sign of the cold person I'd heard on the phone. But there was nothing. Just the same loving, concerned daughter who had been by our side through every appointment, every treatment, every sleepless night in the hospital. Over the next few days, I started noticing things I'd previously overlooked. During visiting hours, Sarah would often excuse herself to make work calls, and these conversations always seemed to require privacy. She'd step into the hallway or disappear into the family lounge, always returning with a bright smile and some excuse about demanding clients or urgent deadlines. Then there was the way she interacted with Richard's doctors and nurses. Sarah would ask detailed questions about his prognosis, his mental clarity, and his treatment timeline. Questions that seemed more clinical than daughterly. When I'd try to join these conversations, she'd gently redirect me. "Don't worry about all the medical jargon, Margaret. I'll handle the complicated stuff so you can focus on just being there for Dad." At home, I'd catch Sarah going through Richard's desk drawers, claiming she was organizing his papers to make things easier during his illness. She'd quickly close folders when I entered the room, explaining that she was just trying to understand his insurance coverage or checking on bill payments. Most disturbing was the way Richard seemed different after Sarah's private visits. He'd become quieter, more withdrawn, and sometimes he'd look at me with a strange expression I couldn't quite identify. When I'd ask if something was wrong, he'd shake his head and say he was just tired, but the look in his eyes suggested something deeper was troubling him. I tried to push these observations away, telling myself I was being paranoid and unfair, but deep down, a voice was beginning to whisper that something was very, very wrong. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while Richard slept fitfully beside me, his breathing labored from the latest round of chemotherapy. The words I'd overheard Sarah speaking echoed in my mind like a broken record. The old man is finally sick enough that we can move forward. But every time I tried to process what those words might mean, my heart rebelled against the implications. This was Sarah we were talking about. My Sarah. The young woman who had cried in my arms when her engagement fell apart. The daughter who brought me flowers every Mother's Day and called me her bonus mom to her friends. The person who had held my hand during Richard's surgery and whispered, "We're going to get through this together, Margaret. We're family." I rolled over and watched Richard's chest rise and fall in the dim light, filtering through our bedroom curtains. How could I possibly suspect Sarah of plotting against us when she'd been nothing but devoted throughout his illness? She'd rearranged her entire work schedule to attend his doctor appointments. She'd researched clinical trials and alternative treatments. She'd even moved back into her childhood bedroom for 2 weeks when Richard was too weak to climb the stairs, helping me care for him around the clock. "You're being ridiculous, Margaret," I whispered to myself in the darkness. "You're under stress. People say things on the phone that sound worse out of context." Maybe Sarah had been talking to a colleague about a difficult legal case. Corporate attorneys dealt with all sorts of complicated situations, involving elderly clients and family disputes. Perhaps the old man was some stubborn client who had been refusing to sign important documents, and his illness had finally made him more cooperative. That had to be it. Sarah would never, could never, refer to her own father in such callous terms. Over the next few days, I found myself making excuses for everything that had seemed suspicious. When Sarah closed folders quickly upon my arrival, I told myself she was protecting me from seeing bills or medical reports that might cause me additional worry. When she had private conversations with doctors, I reasoned that she was simply using her legal training to ask the right questions. Questions that might be too complex for someone like me to understand. The way Richard seemed different after Sarah's visits. Well, of course he was different. He was dying. The man I loved was slowly slipping away from me, and it was natural for both of us to feel the strain of that reality. If he seemed withdrawn or troubled, it was probably because he was processing his own mortality, not because his daughter was poisoning his mind against me. I even managed to reinterpret that chilling phone conversation. "She's probably talking about making Dad more comfortable," I told myself while folding his freshly washed pajamas. Maybe she's working with the doctors to adjust his pain medication so he's more agreeable to treatments he's been resisting. When guilt crept in about my suspicions, I'd remember all the ways Sarah had shown her love over the years. The surprise birthday parties she'd organized for both Richard and me. The way she'd driven through a snowstorm to bring soup when we both had the flu. The photo album she'd made for our 10th wedding anniversary, filled with pictures of our blended family and a note that read, "Thank you for showing me that families are built with love, not just blood." I pushed away my doubts with the fierce determination of a woman who desperately needed to believe in the goodness of the people she loved. "You're imagining things," I told my reflection in the bathroom mirror. "Sarah loves you. Sarah loves her father. Everything is going to be fine." But deep in my heart, a small voice kept whispering that I was lying to myself. 3 weeks after Richard's funeral, I finally gathered the courage to begin the heartbreaking task of going through his personal belongings. The study had been his sanctuary, a room filled with leather-bound books, his grandfather's oak desk, and shelves lined with photographs of our life together. I'd been avoiding this room since he passed, unable to face the finality of sorting through 15 years of shared memories. I started with the easy things, organizing his collection of woodworking magazines, boxing up the novels he'd never finish reading, and carefully wrapping the coffee mug I'd given him that read, "World's Best Husband and Grandpa." Each item I touched carried the scent of his aftershave and the weight of our lost future together. When I reached his desk, I hesitated. This massive piece of furniture had been Richard's command center, where he'd paid bills, planned our vacations, and written the sweet notes he'd leave in my purse when I wasn't looking. The drawers were organized exactly as he'd left them. Pens in one compartment, stamps in another, and important papers filed neatly in manila folders. I was looking for his insurance policies and bank statements, documents I'd need for probate. But as I rifled through the bottom drawer, my fingers brushed against something unexpected. A folder wedged behind the others, almost hidden from view. It was thicker than the rest and unlabeled, which was strange because Richard labeled everything with his precise handwriting. My hands trembled as I pulled the folder free and opened it on his desk. Inside were legal documents I'd never seen before. Multiple drafts of what appeared to be a last will and testament, each one bearing dates from the last 6 months of Richard's life. The papers were crisp and official, covered in legal language that made my head spin, but certain phrases jumped out at me like physical blows. The first draft, dated just 2 months after his cancer diagnosis, looked similar to the will I remembered Richard showing me years ago, the one that divided everything equally between Sarah and me. But as I flipped through the subsequent drafts, I watched in horror as my name gradually disappeared from more and more sections. The house that we'd designed together, the savings account we'd built from both our Social Security checks, the investment portfolio we'd carefully managed for our retirement, all of it slowly transferred to Sarah alone. My breath caught when I reached the final version, dated just 3 weeks before Richard died. In this document, I was left with nothing more than a small cash bequest, $5,000 and my personal belongings. Everything else, including the home we'd shared for 15 years, went directly to Sarah. At the bottom of each page was Richard's signature, shaky but unmistakably his, witnessed by people whose names I didn't recognize. What made my blood run cold was the timing of these changes. Each document was dated during periods when Sarah had suggested I run errands or visit my sister. Times when she'd insisted on staying alone with her father. "To give you a break, Margaret." I remembered those moments clearly now, how Sarah had been so considerate, so thoughtful about my need for self-care during Richard's illness. My legs gave out and I sank into Richard's leather chair, the documents scattered across the desk like evidence of a crime. This wasn't the confused rambling of a sick man or the natural evolution of end-of-life planning. This was systematic, deliberate, and perfectly timed. Each revision had been made when I wasn't there to witness or question what was happening. For the first time since Richard's death, I allowed myself to face the truth I'd been desperately avoiding. Sarah hadn't been protecting me from stress during those private moments with her father. She'd been protecting herself from discovery, while she systematically erased me from the life Richard and I had built together. The morning of Richard's funeral dawned gray and cold, matching the heaviness in my heart. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the black dress Sarah had helped me pick out just days before, and tried to prepare myself for saying goodbye to the love of my life. I had no idea that before the day was over, I'd be saying goodbye to much more than that. The funeral home was packed with people whose lives Richard had touched, neighbors whose porches he'd repaired, co-workers from his 40-year career at the telephone company, and members of our church, where we'd volunteered together every Sunday. The casket was surrounded by flowers, including a massive arrangement of white roses from Sarah, with a ribbon that read, "Beloved Father," in gold script. Sarah played her part perfectly that morning. She wore an elegant black suit and carried tissues, dabbing at her eyes as mourners offered their condolences. She stood beside me in the receiving line, her arm linked through mine, presenting the picture of a grieving daughter supporting her stepmother through their shared loss. "Thank you so much for coming," she'd say to each visitor. "Daddy loved you all so much, and Margaret and I are grateful for your support during this difficult time." I believed her performance completely. Even after discovering those hidden documents, part of me still hoped there was some explanation, some misunderstanding that would restore my faith in the daughter I'd raised. When she squeezed my hand during the pastor's eulogy or whispered, "We'll get through this together, Margaret," I wanted desperately to believe that the cold, calculating person I'd overheard in the hospital had been a figment of my stressed imagination. After the service, as people filed past Richard's casket for one final goodbye, I stood at the foot of the mahogany box that held my husband's body, overwhelmed by the finality of the moment. This was it. The last time I'd be in the same room with the man who'd made me laugh every day for 15 years, who'd held me through countless storms, who'd promised we'd grow old together. Sarah approached me then, her face a mask of sorrow and sympathy. She placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and leaned close, as if to offer comfort in my darkest moment. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Margaret," she whispered, her voice thick with what sounded like genuine emotion. But then her grip on my shoulder tightened, and she leaned even closer, her lips nearly touching my ear. When she spoke again, her voice had transformed completely. Cold, sharp, and filled with venom that made my blood freeze in my veins. "Finally, the old man is gone," she hissed, so quietly that no one else could hear. "And now I can get rid of his pathetic second wife, too. This house, the money, the investments, the bank accounts. It's all mine now, just like it should have been from the beginning. Daddy always loved me more anyway. He just needed a little help remembering that toward the end." I felt the ground shift beneath my feet as her words hit me like physical blows. This wasn't grief talking or stress or even anger. This was pure, calculated malice from someone who had been wearing a mask for 15 years. Sarah pulled back and looked directly into my eyes, her face still showing fake tears for anyone who might be watching, but her eyes were cold and triumphant. "You were never really family, Margaret. You were just a convenience, a nurse and a cook who saved Daddy from having to hire help. But that's over now." She straightened up and returned to her grieving daughter performance, but the damage was done. In that moment, standing beside my husband's casket, I finally saw Sarah for who she really was, and understood that I'd been living with a stranger who hated me for 15 years. In the days following the funeral, I became a detective in my own life, driven by a desperate need to understand the full scope of Sarah's deception. What I discovered made her cruel whispers at Richard's casket seem like just the tip of an iceberg that had been growing beneath the surface of our family for years. I started by calling Dr. Peterson, Richard's oncologist, under the pretense of needing medical records for insurance purposes. What he told me made my hands shake as I gripped the phone. Oh yes, Mrs. Harrison. Sarah was very involved in her father's care. She attended most of his appointments, actually, often when you weren't there. She said you were too emotional to handle the medical details. She was quite concerned about your mental state during his illness. My mental state? I had missed appointments because Sarah had specifically told me the times were wrong or that Richard preferred to go alone to maintain his dignity. I'd spent those missed appointments at home, preparing special meals for his sensitive stomach or researching holistic treatments that might complement his chemotherapy. The nurse was even more revealing. "Your stepdaughter was so devoted," she said warmly. "She'd stay after you left and ask all sorts of questions about your husband's cognitive function and decision-making capacity. She was worried that the medications were affecting his judgment, especially regarding financial decisions. She seemed very concerned about protecting him from potential influences." Influences. The word hit me like a slap. Sarah had been systematically painting me as a gold digger, a manipulative woman who might take advantage of a dying man's weakened state. Next, I drove to Richard's bank, where I'd been going for 15 years. The manager, Mrs. Chen, looked uncomfortable when I asked about recent account activity. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harrison, but Sarah had all the account statements forwarded to her address about 6 months ago. She said it was to help manage your husband's finances during his illness. She had legal documentation giving her power of attorney for financial matters." Power of attorney? Richard had never mentioned giving Sarah power of attorney. When I asked to see the documentation, Mrs. Chen showed me forms dated during one of Richard's chemotherapy sessions, a day when I had been at the hospital pharmacy for hours, waiting for his prescription to be filled. Sarah had suggested I handle that errand to save time. The bank records revealed a pattern that made me sick to my stomach. Over the past 6 months, substantial amounts had been transferred from our joint accounts into new accounts with only Sarah's name. When I questioned these transfers, Mrs. Chen looked genuinely surprised. "But Sarah said these were gifts you and your husband wanted to give her early for tax purposes. She had signed authorizations for everything." My investigation led me to Richard's longtime lawyer, Mr. Bradley, who had handled our original wills. His secretary informed me that he hadn't seen Richard in over 2 years. "Sarah found a new attorney who specialized in elder law," she explained. "She said Richard wanted someone more experienced with terminal illness cases." The new lawyer's office was across town. When I called, the receptionist confirmed that Sarah had been the primary contact for all of Richard's legal matters. "She was very thorough," the woman said admiringly. "She brought her father in several times over the past 6 months to update his estate planning. Such a devoted daughter, making sure everything was properly arranged." Each revelation felt like another knife to the heart. Sarah hadn't just stolen my inheritance. She had orchestrated an elaborate campaign to isolate Richard from me, convince medical professionals that I was unstable, and establish herself as his sole protector and decision-maker. She had turned the people we trusted against me, using their respect for her legal expertise and their sympathy for a devoted daughter caring for her dying father. I wasn't just the victim of a simple betrayal. I was the target of a sophisticated, months-long conspiracy designed to erase me from Richard's life completely. That night, I sat alone in the living room that would soon no longer be mine, surrounded by 15 years of memories that now felt like lies. The house was eerily quiet. No sound of Richard's evening news program, no gentle snoring from his recliner, no warm voice calling my name from the kitchen. Just silence and the crushing weight of betrayal that seemed to press down on my chest until I could barely breathe. I looked around at the life we'd built together, and for the first time, I saw it through Sarah's eyes. The family photos on the mantelpiece, had she been silently resenting every image that included me? The Christmas stockings still hanging from December, mine nestled between Richard's and hers. Had she been planning to throw mine away even then? The quilt I'd made for our 10th anniversary, draped over the couch where Sarah had curled up during her divorce, crying in my arms. Had those tears been fake too? The photo albums were the worst. I opened the leather-bound book from our wedding day, running my fingers over pictures of Sarah as my maid of honor. There she was, 25 years old and radiant, adjusting my veil with such tenderness. "I'm so happy Dad found you," she'd whispered before we walked down the aisle. "You're going to make him so happy." Had it all been an act? Even then, at the very beginning, had she been planning this moment? I flipped through pages of birthday parties, family vacations, and holiday celebrations. Here was Sarah blowing out candles on her 30th birthday cake, while I stood behind her, hands on her shoulders, beaming with maternal pride. There she was at her law school graduation, hugging both Richard and me, tears of joy streaming down her face as she thanked us for believing in her. And here, this one made me sob out loud, was Sarah at my 65th birthday party, presenting me with a framed poem she'd written titled, "My Second Mom," thanking me for loving her like my own daughter. I had loved her like my own daughter. I had worried about her heartbreaks, celebrated her successes, and prayed for her happiness every night for 15 years. When she'd struggled with infertility during her marriage, I'd been the one to hold her while she cried, researching specialists and holding her hand through every disappointment. When her divorce was finalized, I'd been the one to help her rebuild her confidence, telling her she was worthy of love, that she was strong and beautiful and capable of anything. The memories came flooding back like a dam bursting. All those times I'd chosen her side when Richard was being too strict. All those conversations where I'd defended her choices, her independence, her right to live her own life. The money we'd spent on her education, her wedding, her fresh starts. The nights I'd stayed awake worrying when she was going through rough patches. The way my heart had swelled with pride every time someone complimented her, as if her achievements were my own. And through it all, she had been watching me, studying me, learning my weaknesses and my blind spots. She had been perfecting her mask, practicing her performance, and waiting for the perfect moment to destroy the woman who had loved her unconditionally. I curled up on that couch where Sarah had once sought comfort in my arms, and I wept for the daughter I'd lost, the husband who'd been turned against me, and the 15 years of my life that had been built on a foundation of lies. I cried until my chest ached and my eyes were swollen shut, mourning not just for what I'd lost, but for who I'd thought Sarah was, the loving, grateful daughter who had never existed at all. At 67 years old, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my entire life. I woke up the next morning on the living room couch, my body stiff and my face swollen from hours of crying. Sunlight was streaming through the windows that Richard had installed himself, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny reminders of life continuing despite my devastation. For a moment, I felt the familiar weight of despair settling over me like a heavy blanket, threatening to pull me back into the darkness of the night before. But as I sat up and looked around the room, really looked at it, something inside me began to shift. This wasn't just any house. This was our home, the sanctuary Richard and I had created together with our own hands, our own dreams, our own love. Every corner held a memory we'd built. Every piece of furniture had been chosen together. Every paint color had been debated over morning coffee until we found the perfect shade. I walked slowly to the kitchen and made coffee in the machine Richard had bought me for our 5th anniversary, using the morning ritual that had anchored our days together for so many years. As I stood at the window overlooking my garden, the garden where I'd spent countless hours nurturing vegetables that fed our family, flowers that brightened our table, herbs that seasoned our meals, I felt something I hadn't felt since Sarah's whispered confession at the funeral. I felt angry. Not the helpless, devastating anger that comes with betrayal, but something deeper, stronger, more focused. I was angry at Sarah, yes, but I was even angrier at myself for being such an easy target. I had spent 15 years being kind, accommodating, and trusting. I had chosen to see the best in people, to believe in love, to assume good intentions, and Sarah had used every one of those qualities against me. Never let anyone walk all over you, Maggie. Richard's voice echoed in my memory. He'd said those words to me just 2 years ago when our neighbor had tried to pressure us into selling part of our land for below market value. You're stronger than you know. You've survived losing one husband, raised a daughter who wasn't even yours, and built a beautiful life from scratch. Don't you ever forget what you're capable of. I set my coffee cup down with a firm clink against the counter and really looked at myself in the reflection of the kitchen window. I saw a woman who had indeed survived devastating loss before. A woman who had worked full-time while caring for her first husband through his battle with diabetes. A woman who had managed household finances, learned to drive at 52, when her first husband could no longer see well enough to drive, and had somehow found the courage to open her heart to love again at 55. I had raised Sarah not because I had to, but because I chose to. I had loved her, supported her, and sacrificed for her not out of weakness but out of strength. And now she thought she could simply discard me like an old piece of furniture that had outlived its usefulness? Not today, Sarah, I said aloud to my reflection, and my voice was steadier than it had been in weeks. Not ever. I wasn't just a grieving widow who could be pushed around and discarded. I was Margaret Ann Harrison, a woman who had survived 67 years of life's challenges, who had loved deeply and lost deeply and somehow found the strength to love again. I was a woman who had built businesses, raised children, and created beauty wherever I went. And I was a woman who was not going down without a fight. Sarah had made one crucial mistake in her elaborate plan. She had underestimated the woman she was trying to destroy. The first thing I did was drive across town to the law office of Catherine Chen, a woman whose reputation for fighting elder abuse cases was legendary in our community. I'd read about her in the local newspaper, a fierce advocate who had successfully challenged fraudulent wills and exposed family members who preyed on vulnerable seniors. If anyone could help me navigate Sarah's web of deception, it would be her. Catherine was a small woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an intensity that reminded me of a bird of prey. She listened without interruption as I laid out the entire story, spreading Richard's hidden will drafts across her mahogany desk like evidence at a crime scene. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and smiled grimly. "Mrs. Harrison, your stepdaughter made several critical mistakes," she said, tapping her pen against the documents. "First, these changes show a clear pattern of undue influence. Second, the timing coincides perfectly with your husband's medical treatments, which affected his cognitive capacity. Third, she isolated him from you during critical decision-making periods. And fourth," she paused dramatically, "she got greedy." Catherine explained that Sarah's systematic approach, while clever, had left a paper trail that actually worked in our favor. The bank transfers, the medical appointments, the legal consultations, everything was documented and time-stamped. "Criminals always think they're smarter than they are," Catherine noted. "Your stepdaughter documented her own fraud." Over the next week, Catherine and I built our case methodically. We subpoenaed Richard's medical records, which showed his cognitive decline during the exact periods when the will changes were made. We gathered testimony from Dr. Peterson and the nursing staff, who confirmed that Sarah had been controlling access to Richard and questioning his mental capacity. We obtained bank records showing the suspicious transfers and the forged authorization signatures. But I wanted more than just legal victory. I wanted Sarah to experience the same shock and humiliation she had inflicted on me. That's when I remembered something that made my heart race with possibility. Richard had mentioned a safety deposit box years ago, one he'd opened when we first married but never talked about again. He'd shown me the key once, a small silver thing he kept in an old cigar box in his workshop. I found the key exactly where I remembered it, tucked between his reading glasses and a handful of old receipts. The safety deposit box was at our original bank, the one we'd used before Sarah convinced Richard to switch to her preferred institution. The bank manager, Mrs. Rodriguez, had known Richard for over 20 years and was shocked to hear about the will controversy. Inside the safety deposit box, I found treasure more valuable than gold, a handwritten letter from Richard, dated just 1 month before his death, along with a properly witnessed will that left everything to me. But the letter was what made my hands tremble with vindication. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "if you're reading this, then Sarah's deception has probably been revealed. I've known for months what she's been doing. The private meetings, the manipulation, the lies about your intentions. I've been pretending to go along with her plan while secretly protecting you." Richard had discovered Sarah's scheme early on and had been playing a careful game, appearing to comply with her wishes while actually safeguarding our real estate and assets through legal maneuvers she knew nothing about. He had documented every conversation, every manipulation attempt, every cruel comment Sarah had made about me when she thought he was too medicated to remember. The letter concluded, "Sarah underestimated both of us, my love. She forgot that I spent 40 years as a telephone company investigator and that you're the strongest woman I've ever known. Show her what happens when she tries to destroy a love like ours." My revenge plan was no longer just about justice. It was about honoring my husband's final gift to me. The formal reading of Richard's will was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Friday morning at the offices of Morrison and Associates, the law firm Sarah had chosen to handle what she believed would be her moment of ultimate triumph. I spent the previous evening carefully preparing for what would either be my vindication or my final humiliation, depending on how well Richard's secret plan would hold up under legal scrutiny. I chose my outfit with the same care a general might select armor for battle. A navy blue suit Richard had always complimented, pearl earrings he'd given me for our 10th anniversary, and the wedding ring I refused to remove despite everything that had happened. I wanted to look dignified, composed, and nothing like the broken woman Sarah expected to encounter. Catherine met me at the law office 30 minutes early, carrying a briefcase that contained the real will, Richard's letter, and all the evidence we'd gathered over the past 2 weeks. Her confidence was reassuring, but my stomach still churned with nervous energy. "Remember," she said as we walked up the steps to the imposing brick building, "let them read the fraudulent will first. Let Sarah have her moment of triumph. The shock will be much more devastating when we reveal the truth." The conference room was exactly what I'd expected. Dark wood paneling, leather chairs, and windows that overlooked the town square where Richard and I had attended countless festivals and community events over the years. Sarah was already seated at the polished table, wearing a black designer suit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She had positioned herself at the head of the table like a queen holding court, her briefcase open and legal documents neatly arranged in front of her. "Margaret," she said with fake sympathy as I entered, rising to give me one of her practiced hugs. "I know this is difficult, but we need to handle Daddy's affairs properly. I've taken care of all the arrangements to make this as painless as possible for you." Her condescending tone made my jaw clench, but I forced myself to smile graciously. "That's so thoughtful of you, Sarah. You've always been so thorough in your planning." Several other people filtered into the room. Richard's nephew Tom from Denver, our next-door neighbors the Hendersons who had been named as witnesses, and 2 elderly women from our church who had been included as minor beneficiaries. Sarah greeted each of them warmly, playing the role of the gracious hostess, managing her father's final affairs with appropriate solemnity. Mr. Morrison, Sarah's chosen attorney, was a thin man in his 60s who spoke in the careful, measured tones of someone accustomed to delivering both good and bad news to grieving families. He arranged his papers with ceremonial precision and began with the standard legal formalities about the purpose of the gathering and the validity of the document they were about to read. Sarah sat back in her chair with barely concealed satisfaction, occasionally glancing at me with what I now recognized as predatory anticipation. She was savoring this moment, the culmination of months of careful manipulation and planning. In her mind, she had already won. The house would be hers within weeks, the bank accounts would be transferred to her name, and the troublesome stepmother would be nothing more than an unpleasant memory. As Mr. Morrison cleared his throat and began reading the terms of the will that would leave me with nothing but $5,000 and my personal belongings, I sat quietly with my hands folded in my lap, waiting for exactly the right moment to destroy Sarah's world just as thoroughly as she had tried to destroy mine. The envelope containing Richard's real will and his devastating letter sat in my purse like a loaded weapon, ready to fire. Mr. Morrison finished reading the fraudulent will with the same dry professionalism he might use to read a grocery list. And so, in conclusion, the deceased bequeaths the sum of $5,000 and all personal belongings to Margaret Harrison, with the remainder of the estate, including the family residence and all financial assets, passing to Sarah Elizabeth Harrison, his beloved daughter. The room fell silent except for the soft ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Sarah's smile was radiant as she looked around the table, her eyes lingering on my face to savor what she expected to be my devastation. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison," she said smoothly. "I know this is difficult for everyone, but Daddy wanted to ensure his affairs were handled properly." Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly sensing something wasn't right about leaving a wife of 15 years with practically nothing. But he remained silent out of respect for what he assumed were his uncle's final wishes. The Hendersons exchanged worried glances, and Mrs. Patterson from church looked genuinely distressed on my behalf. "Well," Sarah continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "I suppose that concludes our business. Margaret, I'll need you to vacate the house within 30 days, as specified in the will. I'm sure you understand. It's what Daddy wanted." That's when I stood up, my movements calm and deliberate. Every eye in the room turned to me as I reached into my purse and withdrew the envelope that would change everything. My hands were steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Actually, Sarah," I said, my voice clear and strong, "there's something you should see before we conclude anything." I walked around the table and placed the envelope directly in front of her. "This came from your father's safety deposit box, the one you didn't know about." Sarah's confident expression flickered for just a moment before she regained her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about, Margaret. There was no other safety deposit box. You're just having trouble accepting reality." "Open it," I said simply, stepping back to watch her face. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal on the envelope. The first thing she pulled out was Richard's letter, written in his distinctive handwriting on his personal letterhead. As her eyes scanned the opening lines, I watched the color drain from her face like water from a broken dam. "My dearest Margaret," she read aloud in a whisper, then stopped abruptly as the implications hit her. Her mouth opened and closed, soundlessly as she continued reading silently, each word clearly hitting her like a physical blow. The second document was even more devastating. Richard's real will, properly witnessed and notarized, dated 1 week after the fraudulent version she'd orchestrated. This will not only left everything to me but included a detailed addendum documenting Sarah's manipulation, attempts, and explicitly stating that any previous wills had been signed under duress and coercion. "That's impossible," Sarah breathed. But her voice lacked conviction. Her carefully constructed mask was crumbling before our eyes as she realized the magnitude of her miscalculation. Catherine chose that moment to speak up from her position near the door. "Mrs. Harrison, would you like me to read the relevant portions of your husband's actual final will to the assembled witnesses?" The room erupted in shocked murmurs as the truth became clear. Richard had known about Sarah's scheme all along and had been playing a chess game she didn't even know she was losing. Tom's face went from confusion to anger, as he realized his cousin had tried to defraud her stepmother. The neighbors looked horrified, and Mrs. Patterson actually gasped audibly. Sarah sat frozen in her chair, still clutching the letter that exposed 15 years of her deception, while her world collapsed around her in front of the very people she'd expected to witness my humiliation. The aftermath of that day in the lawyer's office unfolded with the swift inevitability of justice too long delayed. Within 48 hours, Catherine had filed all the necessary paperwork to execute Richard's true final will, and Sarah found herself facing not only the loss of her anticipated inheritance, but also criminal charges for fraud, elder abuse, and attempted theft of estate assets. The court proceedings that followed were a masterclass in how greed ultimately destroys the person consumed by it. Sarah, who had spent her career as a corporate attorney manipulating legal systems to her advantage, now found herself on the wrong side of the law she had twisted for her own purposes. The judge, a stern woman who had seen too many cases of family members preying on vulnerable elderly relatives, showed no mercy when presented with the overwhelming evidence of Sarah's calculated deception. "Ms. Harrison," Judge Martinez said during the sentencing, "you used your legal expertise and your position as a trusted family member to systematically abuse and defraud a terminally ill man and his wife. You manipulated medical professionals, financial institutions, and legal processes to steal an inheritance that was never rightfully yours. The court finds your actions particularly reprehensible because they represent a profound betrayal of the most sacred bonds of family trust." Sarah received a sentence of 3 years in prison and was ordered to pay full restitution for all the money she had illegally transferred, plus damages for emotional distress and legal fees. Her law license was suspended pending a disciplinary review that would likely end her legal career permanently. The woman who had whispered cruel words at her father's funeral now sat in handcuffs, her designer suit replaced with an orange jumpsuit, her confident smirk replaced with the hollow expression of someone whose carefully constructed life had imploded spectacularly. More satisfying than Sarah's legal punishment, however, was what happened next. The story of her fraud became front-page news in our small town, where Richard had been beloved and respected for decades. The narrative that emerged wasn't just about inheritance theft. It was about a community discovering that one of their own had been living among them as a fraud for 15 years. Mrs. Chen at the bank apologized profusely for her role in facilitating the illegal transfers, implementing new safeguards to prevent similar abuse of elderly customers. Dr. Peterson and his medical staff underwent additional training on recognizing signs of family manipulation during end-of-life care. The law firm Sarah had used was investigated for their failure to properly verify the circumstances of Richard's will changes, ultimately facing sanctions for their inadequate due diligence. But the most meaningful resolution came from the community itself. Richard's friends and neighbors, horrified by how close they had come to witnessing an innocent woman's life destroyed, rallied around me with a warmth that helped heal the wounds Sarah's betrayal had left. The Hendersons brought casseroles and helped me tend Richard's garden. Tom flew in from Denver to help sort through family photographs and share stories about his uncle that I'd never heard. Mrs. Patterson organized a memorial service at our church, where person after person stood up to share memories of Richard and to express their outrage at how Sarah had nearly succeeded in erasing me from his legacy. I used part of my restored inheritance to establish the Richard Harrison Foundation for Elder Protection, providing legal assistance and support services for seniors facing family fraud and abuse. It felt like the perfect way to honor Richard's memory while ensuring that other families wouldn't suffer what we had endured. Sarah had spent 15 years planning my destruction, but in the end her elaborate scheme had accomplished something she never intended. It had revealed the true strength of the community Richard and I had built together, and it had given me a purpose larger than myself in my golden years. 2 years have passed since that devastating day in the lawyer's office, when Sarah's mask finally slipped completely. As I sit here in the same kitchen where Richard and I shared thousands of morning coffees, watching the sunrise paint our garden in shades of gold and amber, I find myself reflecting on the hard lessons this ordeal taught me about family, trust, and the resilience of the human spirit. The woman I am today is fundamentally different from the naive, trusting soul who once believed that love could overcome any obstacle, and that family bonds were sacred and unbreakable. I've learned that blood doesn't automatically create loyalty, and that sometimes the people closest to us are capable of the deepest betrayals. I've discovered that evil can wear a beautiful mask for decades, perfecting its performance while plotting destruction behind loving smiles and tender embraces. But I've also learned something far more important. I am stronger than I ever imagined possible. The woman who once avoided confrontation and always chose to see the best in people has evolved into someone who can fight fiercely when cornered, who can strategize with the best of them, and who refuses to be victimized by those who mistake kindness for weakness. Richard's final gift to me wasn't just the inheritance he protected or the letter that exposed Sarah's lies. His greatest gift was showing me that even in his final moments, when illness had weakened his body, his love for me remained strong enough to outsmart a manipulative daughter who thought she had him under her control. He taught me that true love doesn't just say pretty words, it takes action, even when that action requires sacrifice and careful planning. The Richard Harrison Foundation has helped over 200 families in the past 18 months, providing legal assistance, emotional support, and advocacy for elderly victims of family fraud. Every case we handle reminds me that Sarah and I were not unique. There are predators and families across America who view their aging relatives as nothing more than ATM machines to be drained before they die. But there are also fighters like me, people who refuse to go quietly into that good night when someone tries to steal their dignity and their legacy. I've learned that justice isn't always swift, and it's rarely perfect, but it is possible when good people refuse to look the other way. The community that rallied around me, the legal professionals who fought for what was right, the medical staff who implemented new safeguards, all of them played a role in ensuring that Sarah's cruelty didn't go unpunished and that other families might be spared similar suffering. Most importantly, I've discovered that surviving betrayal doesn't have to make you bitter or cynical. It can make you wiser, stronger, and more determined to protect others from experiencing the same pain. I still believe in love, in family, and in the basic goodness of most people. But now I also believe in the power of vigilance, the importance of documentation, and the necessity of fighting back when someone tries to destroy your life. Sarah sits in her prison cell today, probably still convinced that she was somehow the victim in this story, that her father and I conspired against her rightful inheritance. But I know the truth. She was the architect of her own destruction, undone by the same greed and arrogance that drove her to betray the people who loved her most. So I ask you, watching this story unfold, what would you do if someone you trusted completely turned out to be your worst enemy? Would you have the strength to fight back when everything seemed hopeless? How well do you really know the people you call family? Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and remember, never let anyone convince you that you're powerless. Sometimes the person who seems weakest is actually the one with the most to fight for.